The most dangerous man in the room is rarely the one making the loudest noise. At exactly 9:14 on a cool Tuesday morning, the polished marble lobby of Whitmore National Bank looked like every other successful financial headquarters in downtown Denver. Customers waited patiently beneath warm lights, the aroma of fresh coffee drifted from a nearby cafe kiosk, keyboards clicked behind sleek glass offices, and quiet conversations blended into the gentle rhythm of another ordinary business day. No one noticed the middle-aged security guard standing near the front entrance with calm blue eyes and a neatly pressed uniform. His name tag simply read Mason Beckett. Most employees barely remembered his name. To them, he was the polite man who opened doors for elderly customers, helped children find lost parents, and quietly reminded visitors where to check in. Every evening, he left exactly on time because someone much more important than any executive was waiting for him at home. His 9-year-old daughter believed her father was the strongest man in the world, not because he carried a badge, but because he never missed bedtime stories. Upstairs, Claire Whitmore stepped out of the executive elevator with the confidence that had built one of the fastest-growing regional banks in America. At 36, she was respected throughout the financial industry for her sharp instincts, disciplined leadership, and ability to remain composed under pressure. Her tailored navy suit reflected professionalism rather than extravagance, and every employee instinctively straightened as she walked through the lobby. She acknowledged greetings with brief smiles but rarely slowed her pace. She noticed numbers, performance reports, and quarterly forecasts. She almost never noticed the quiet security guard who respectfully held open the lobby door every morning. Then everything changed in less than 10 seconds. The front doors swung open with unexpected force as 3 men wearing matching work jackets hurried inside carrying large equipment cases that looked ordinary enough to avoid immediate suspicion. At first, several customers assumed they were contractors arriving for scheduled maintenance. Then the atmosphere shifted. Calm voices became nervous whispers. Confused expressions replaced morning routines. The visitors demanded everyone's attention with unsettling confidence while directing people to remain still and cooperate. The lobby, so full of movement only moments before, suddenly felt frozen beneath the bright lights. Claire instinctively stepped forward, refusing to allow panic to spread among her employees, but before anyone could fully understand what was happening, she found herself separated from the people around her and escorted toward the exit. Dozens of witnesses stood motionless, unsure what to do next. Someone reached for a phone. Another quietly prayed. A child began to cry before his mother gently held him close. Through all the confusion, Mason Beckett never raised his voice. He never rushed. He simply watched. His breathing remained steady. His eyes followed every movement with remarkable precision, quietly measuring distance, timing, and opportunity as though he had rehearsed this moment years before. Then, just as the vehicle waiting outside prepared to leave with the bank's CEO, the security guard who had spent years blending into the background was no longer standing where anyone expected him to be. He had vanished as silently as a passing shadow, and for the first time that morning, destiny began moving faster than fear. If you enjoy thoughtful stories with real emotion, please subscribe and support the channel. We truly appreciate it. And for those watching, have you ever experienced something like this in your own life? Share your story in the comments. Now, let's get back to the story. Mason Beckett did not become invisible overnight. Life had quietly taught him that the strongest walls were built from patience, discipline, and silence. Long before anyone inside Whitmore National Bank knew his name, he had already learned that respect was never something you demanded. It was something you earned when nobody was watching. Every weekday began at exactly 5:15 in the morning. Before the city lights faded into sunrise, Mason was already standing in a small kitchen preparing blueberry pancakes because his daughter insisted Tuesdays tasted better with blueberries. 9-year-old Lily Beckett would shuffle into the room wearing oversized socks, rubbing sleep from her eyes before wrapping her arms around her father without saying a word. They had developed their own language after years of facing life together. A smile meant everything was going to be all right. A hug meant no explanation was necessary. After breakfast, Mason drove an aging silver pickup nearly 12 miles across Denver to drop Lily off at Jefferson Elementary. Every afternoon she reminded him to stay safe at work, and every afternoon he smiled the same quiet smile before telling her he would be home in time for dinner. He never made promises he could not keep. At the bank, his routine rarely changed. He greeted customers, assisted elderly visitors with heavy doors, helped parents calm restless children waiting in line, and quietly returned forgotten wallets before anyone realized they were missing. He remembered birthdays, favorite coffee orders, and the names of employees' children without ever mentioning that he did. Most people assumed he was simply kind by nature. Others assumed he had never dreamed of becoming anything more than a security guard. Neither assumption was completely true. Claire Whitmore had crossed paths with Mason nearly every morning for the past 11 months. Their conversations never lasted longer than a few seconds. "Good morning, Mr. Beckett." "Good morning, Ms. Whitmore. Have a wonderful day." "Thank you, you as well." Nothing more. She appreciated professionalism but had never looked beyond the uniform. In her world, every minute carried financial value, every meeting demanded preparation, and every decision affected thousands of employees. She respected the people who worked for her, yet she rarely had time to truly know them. Mason understood that better than anyone. He never expected recognition. He simply believed every job deserved dignity when performed with honesty. There was, however, one habit that puzzled several coworkers. During quiet moments, Mason never looked at his phone. Instead, he quietly studied reflections in polished windows, emergency exits, ceiling cameras, delivery schedules, and the steady flow of people entering and leaving the building. New employees joked that he noticed everything except office gossip. Veteran tellers laughed that nothing escaped Mr. Beckett's eyes. Even the maintenance crew occasionally asked how he always knew when something needed repair before anyone reported it. Mason always answered with the same gentle smile. Paying attention costs nothing. Ignoring details can become expensive. Nobody thought much about those words until that unforgettable Tuesday morning. As confusion spread across the lobby and frightened voices echoed against the marble walls, Mason's calm expression never changed. While everyone else watched the unfolding crisis, he quietly noticed something almost no one else did. One of the visitors had glanced toward the underground parking entrance for less than a second, as if silently confirming an escape route. Another had unconsciously adjusted the strap of an equipment case that seemed heavier than its appearance suggested. The smallest details often carried the biggest truths. Mason lowered his gaze for one brief moment, touched the simple silver ring he still wore in memory of his late wife, and took one silent breath before disappearing through a service hallway that most people inside the building had forgotten even existed. The service hallway behind the executive offices was quiet except for the soft hum of ventilation fans and the distant echo of hurried footsteps above. Mason Beckett moved through the narrow corridor without rushing, yet every step arrived exactly when it needed to. Years of ordinary routines had allowed him to memorize every maintenance door, every emergency exit, every delivery entrance, and every blind corner inside the building. He had never studied them because he expected trouble. He had studied them because protecting people meant understanding the places where fear often traveled first. Outside, the black utility van rolled slowly toward the underground parking exit. Claire Whitmore sat silently in the rear compartment, her hands folded tightly in her lap as she fought to keep her breathing steady. She understood that panic solved nothing. Throughout her career she had guided companies through financial storms, public criticism, and impossible negotiations, but this was different. For the first time in many years, success, preparation, and influence offered no immediate answers. She quietly watched the three strangers exchange brief conversations that sounded more like rehearsed checklists than emotional arguments. Their movements were controlled. Their voices remained low. Everything about them suggested planning rather than chaos. That realization unsettled her even more. Back inside the bank, employees slowly began comforting frightened customers while emergency calls reached local authorities. Several people searched desperately for the missing security guard. One young teller whispered that perhaps he had run away. An older accountant immediately shook his head. Not Mr. Beckett. He would never leave people behind. Those simple words carried more confidence than anyone expected. Mason emerged through a maintenance exit that opened into the underground parking structure nearly 100 yards from the street. The cool concrete air smelled faintly of motor oil and rain carried in by passing vehicles. Rows of support columns stretched into long shadows beneath bright fluorescent lights. Everything appeared still. Too still. Mason paused behind one of the columns and listened. He did not search with his eyes first. He searched with patience. A delivery elevator chimed somewhere above. Tires rolled softly across polished concrete. Then he heard what he had expected all along. The quiet click of a vehicle door opening before the engine started. He calmly adjusted the small radio clip to his uniform, but instead of speaking into it, he removed the battery and slipped it into his pocket. Noise would only slow him down. Silence remained his greatest ally. Claire looked toward the front windshield as the van slowed unexpectedly before reaching the exit ramp. One of the men frowned. Another leaned toward the side mirror with growing confusion. There was nothing blocking the path ahead, yet something felt different. The air itself seemed to have changed. The driver glanced toward the security camera mounted above the garage entrance. It had quietly rotated away from the lane as though someone had redirected its view only moments earlier. Nobody inside the vehicle noticed the lone figure standing several yards away beside an ordinary maintenance cart. Mason did not appear threatening. He stood with relaxed shoulders and calm eyes, looking almost like an employee waiting to begin another routine task. Yet there was an unmistakable confidence in the way he carried himself, a confidence born not from pride but from complete self-control. Claire recognized him immediately. For a brief second she wondered whether he had come to negotiate, to distract, or simply to witness what happened next. Then Mason looked directly toward the windshield. His expression remained peaceful, almost compassionate, as though he still believed that every difficult moment offered one final chance for people to choose a better path before the truth revealed who they really were. Mason Beckett did not raise his voice. He did not make demands. He simply took one measured step forward until the bright overhead lights reflected softly across the polished concrete between him and the waiting van. One of the men lowered his window only a few inches and frowned. "Move aside," he said with quiet impatience. Mason remained exactly where he was. "There are innocent people depending on how this ends," he replied evenly. "Let her walk away, and everyone leaves with a better tomorrow." The words were calm, almost gentle, yet they carried a confidence that did not belong to an ordinary security guard. Inside the vehicle, Claire Whitmore watched him with growing disbelief. She expected fear. She expected hesitation. Instead, the man who had quietly opened doors for customers every morning stood as though the outcome had already been decided somewhere deep inside his heart. One of the strangers exchanged a brief glance with another before opening the passenger door. His expression suggested confidence mixed with curiosity. "You should go back inside," he said. "This is not your responsibility." Mason answered with the faintest smile. "Protecting people has always been my responsibility." The air seemed to grow still. Somewhere in the distance a siren echoed faintly through downtown traffic, still several minutes away. Water dripped rhythmically from a pipe above, each drop striking the concrete with remarkable clarity. Claire noticed something unusual. Mason was not watching the faces of the three men. His eyes calmly shifted between reflections on nearby vehicle windows, the polished floor, the support columns, and the position of every open door around the garage. It was almost as though he could see the entire room without looking directly at anyone. The man nearest the passenger door took another cautious step, but before anyone fully understood what had happened, he paused in surprise and instinctively looked down. His attention had shifted away from Claire for only a brief moment. That single distraction was enough. Mason quietly guided Claire toward the open space beside the maintenance cart with a reassuring gesture, never rushing, never creating panic. She moved almost without thinking, surprised by how naturally she trusted his calm voice. "Keep walking," he said softly. "Do not look back." She obeyed. The remaining two men immediately redirected their attention, but every attempt to regain control seemed to meet unexpected obstacles. A rolling maintenance cart gently shifted into their path. An automatically closing security gate, triggered moments earlier, slowly narrowed the vehicle exit lane. Bright overhead lights reflected across the windshield, making it difficult to judge distance. Nothing happened dramatically. Instead, every small detail quietly favored the man who had spent months learning every inch of the building. Claire reached the shelter of a concrete column and finally turned around. Mason still stood alone in the open garage. His posture remained relaxed, his breathing steady, his hands visible at his sides. He looked less like someone confronting danger and more like someone patiently waiting for a difficult conversation to end. The confidence in his eyes unsettled everyone present. It was not confidence built on strength alone. It came from experience, discipline, and an unwavering refusal to surrender his principles. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Then, from somewhere above, the sound of approaching police vehicles began to echo through the parking structure. The three strangers exchanged uncertain looks for the first time that morning. Mason never celebrated. He never smiled with triumph. He simply remained still, giving them one final opportunity to choose wisdom over pride before the next chapter of their lives unfolded. The first police cruiser swept into the lower entrance with flashing lights reflecting across the concrete walls, but nobody rushed forward. The officers understood immediately that one wrong decision could make a tense situation even worse. They remained at a careful distance while issuing calm instructions through their vehicle speakers. The sound echoed through the garage before fading into a heavy silence. Mason Beckett did not look toward the arriving officers. His attention remained fixed on the three men standing beside the van. His breathing never changed. Claire Whitmore watched from behind the concrete column, her heart still racing, yet something inside her was beginning to settle. For reasons she could not explain, standing only a few yards behind the quiet security guard felt safer than being surrounded by a dozen police officers. She had spent years studying confidence in boardrooms, recognizing it in successful investors and accomplished executives. What she saw in Mason was something entirely different. It was not confidence built on status or authority. It was the quiet certainty of a man who had already accepted responsibility long before anyone else realized it existed. One of the men slowly raised his hands and glanced toward the approaching officers. Another hesitated, looking first at Mason and then at the narrowing exit behind him. The third lowered his head slightly as though realizing the carefully planned escape had quietly disappeared one decision at a time. Nobody shouted. Nobody rushed. The tension dissolved not through force, but through the steady presence of someone who refused to surrender either his composure or his compassion. An officer carefully stepped forward and instructed everyone to remain exactly where they were. Within moments, additional officers arrived and calmly secured the scene. Claire watched as standard procedures unfolded with remarkable professionalism. Questions were asked. Directions were followed. The uncertainty that had gripped the garage only minutes earlier slowly gave way to relief. Then came a sound that seemed almost ordinary, yet somehow carried extraordinary weight. The gentle metallic click of handcuffs echoed once beneath the concrete ceiling. It was a familiar sound to every officer present. Yet before anyone could continue with routine procedure, one of the men unexpectedly lifted his eyes toward Mason. There was no anger in his expression. No bitterness. Only recognition. A slow smile appeared across his face, almost respectful, as though he had finally solved a mystery that had puzzled him from the beginning. Several nearby officers paused instinctively. Claire noticed the change immediately. Even the detectives approaching from the stairwell slowed their pace. The man gave a quiet nod before speaking words that seemed completely out of place. "Welcome back, Chief." The garage fell silent. One officer blinked in surprise. Another turned toward Mason with an expression that shifted from confusion to disbelief. Claire felt the words settle in her mind without understanding them. "Chief. Not Mr. Beckett. Not security guard. Chief." She looked at Mason, expecting him to deny it, laugh it off, or ask what the man meant. Instead, he simply closed his eyes for one brief second, almost as though an old memory had quietly returned after years of remaining buried. When he finally opened them again, the peaceful kindness had never left his face, but there was something else now, something older and far heavier. It was the look of a man carrying a history he had never wanted the world to remember, and every experienced officer standing in that garage suddenly realized they were no longer looking at an ordinary bank security guard. No one spoke for several long seconds after those two unexpected words echoed through the garage. The flashing lights from the patrol vehicles continued to sweep across the concrete walls, but the atmosphere had changed completely. It was no longer a scene defined by fear. It had become a room filled with unanswered questions. Mason Beckett quietly lowered his eyes, offering no explanation. The officers nearest him exchanged uncertain glances before a black sport utility vehicle rolled into the garage with calm purpose. The driver's door opened, and an older man wearing the gold insignia of a deputy chief stepped out. His silver hair reflected beneath the overhead lights, and years of leadership were visible in every measured step he took. Several officers instinctively straightened their posture the moment they recognized Deputy Chief Ronald Hayes. He acknowledged no one at first. His attention remained fixed entirely on Mason. Claire Whitmore watched as the seasoned commander walked forward until only a few feet separated the two men. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then, without hesitation, Deputy Chief Hayes stood perfectly upright and rendered a crisp salute. The surrounding officers froze. A patrol officer quietly whispered, "Who is he?" Another officer slowly shook his head. "I do not know. But the deputy chief certainly does." Mason looked almost uncomfortable with the attention. After a brief pause, he returned the salute with quiet respect before lowering his hand again. "It has been a long time, sir," Hayes said softly. Mason offered the smallest smile. "Long enough." Hayes nodded with understanding that seemed to reach far beyond ordinary conversation. "I hoped retirement was treating you well." Mason glanced toward the direction where Claire stood safely with several officers. "Being a father has always been the better assignment." The deputy chief smiled, though his eyes carried unmistakable admiration. Claire listened carefully, struggling to connect the pieces. Retirement. Assignment. Chief. None of those words belonged to the man she believed she knew. Hayes finally turned toward the gathering officers. "Some of you were still in elementary school when this man was leading one of the most respected federal crisis response teams in the country," he said calmly. A ripple of disbelief moved through the garage. Mason remained completely silent. Hayes continued with obvious care, revealing only what respect allowed. "He spent years resolving situations where patience saved more lives than force ever could. His team became known for ending impossible days with families returning home together." Claire felt her heart tighten. She thought about the way Mason had calmly watched reflections instead of faces. The way he had spoken without raising his voice. The way every decision seemed guided by protecting people rather than proving himself. Suddenly none of it seemed mysterious anymore. It made perfect sense. One younger detective looked toward Mason with open amazement. "If someone with your record wanted a leadership position anywhere in the country, every agency would have welcomed you." Mason answered without hesitation. "Leadership is not a title. It is a responsibility. And my daughter needed her father more than the country needed another commander." Silence settled once again across the garage. Even the radio seemed quieter. Claire had spent years surrounded by ambitious people chasing promotions, recognition, and influence. Standing before her now was a man who had quietly walked away from every honor simply because one little girl deserved to grow up with a father who came home every evening. For the first time since she had become chief executive officer, Claire Whitmore realized that the greatest measure of success could never be found on a balance sheet. Sometimes it was found in the quiet dignity of a man who chose an ordinary uniform because love mattered more than glory. The official statements continued for another hour, but Mason Beckett quietly slipped away the moment the investigators confirmed that everyone was safe. He did not wait for reporters. He did not stand before cameras. While television crews gathered outside the bank hoping to interview the mysterious security guard, Mason was already driving across town beneath the warm afternoon sun. The traffic moved slowly along Interstate 25, giving him something he rarely allowed himself during difficult days. Time to think. His phone finally vibrated on the passenger seat. The screen displayed the name of Jefferson Elementary School. Mason answered immediately. "Hello." The cheerful voice of Lily's teacher came through. "Mr. Beckett, Lily wanted to know if you are still picking her up today." Mason smiled without realizing it. "I would not miss it." 20 minutes later, he parked beside the familiar row of family vehicles outside the school. Children poured through the front doors carrying backpacks almost as large as themselves. The moment Lily spotted her father, she ran toward him with complete confidence, wrapping both arms around his waist. "You are late by 4 minutes," she said with playful seriousness. Mason laughed softly. "I owe you 1 scoop of chocolate ice cream." She looked up with bright blue eyes. 2 scoops. That sounds like a fair negotiation. Claire Whitmore watched the entire moment from inside her own vehicle across the street. She had followed from a respectful distance after learning where Mason had gone. She had intended to thank him immediately after everything that had happened, but as she watched father and daughter laughing together beneath the Colorado sunshine, she found herself unable to interrupt. This was clearly the most important meeting on Mason's schedule. Lily happily climbed into the old pickup truck before noticing Claire's luxury sedan parked nearby. "Daddy," she whispered, "the lady from your bank is looking this way." Mason turned and immediately recognized Claire standing beside her car. For a brief moment he looked almost embarrassed, as though she had discovered something deeply personal. Claire walked forward slowly, carrying none of the confidence that usually filled executive boardrooms. Today she was simply a grateful woman approaching the person who had protected countless lives, including her own. "I hope I am not interrupting," she said gently. Mason shook his head. "Not at all." Claire smiled toward Lily. "You must be Lily." The little girl nodded politely. "Daddy says it is important to remember everyone's name." Claire felt those simple words settle quietly in her heart. He had remembered everyone else's names, yet she had almost never remembered his. "Your father is an extraordinary man," Claire said. Lily looked genuinely confused. "I know," she answered. "Does everybody else not know that?" Neither adult spoke for several seconds. The innocence of a child had quietly exposed a truth that no impressive title could erase. Claire realized that while the world had admired financial success and professional achievement, one little girl had measured greatness by entirely different standards. A father who kept his promises. A father who came home every evening. A father who chose bedtime stories over recognition. Claire finally looked back at Mason. "There are many things I still do not understand." Mason rested one hand gently on Lily's shoulder. "Some chapters belong in the past," he replied. "The only one I am still writing is this one." Claire nodded with quiet respect. As the old pickup pulled away toward home, she remained standing beside her luxury sedan, watching until it disappeared beyond the afternoon traffic. For the first time in many years, she realized that the richest person she had met that day drove the oldest truck in the parking lot, wore the simplest uniform, and measured success by the smile of a 9-year-old daughter instead of the size of a corner office. Monday morning arrived with the familiar rhythm of ordinary life. The glass doors of Whitmore National Bank opened at 8 o'clock sharp, customers returned with coffee cups in hand, keyboards filled the offices with their steady music, and conversations slowly replaced the uneasy silence that had lingered after the extraordinary events of the previous week. Mason Beckett arrived 5 minutes early, wearing the same neatly pressed security uniform, carrying the same insulated lunch bag Lily had decorated with tiny blue stars years earlier. Nothing about him suggested he had become the quiet subject of countless conversations throughout the city. Several employees looked at him differently now. Some offered warmer smiles. Others nodded with a respect they had never shown before. Mason greeted each person exactly as he always had. "Good morning. Welcome back. I hope you have a wonderful day." His routine never changed because his character had never depended on other people's opinions. Claire Whitmore watched from the executive balcony overlooking the lobby. She had spent the entire weekend reading every report Deputy Chief Ronald Hayes had been legally permitted to share. The official records were surprisingly brief. Commendations without details. Letters of gratitude with entire paragraphs redacted. Awards quietly accepted and then forgotten. One notation appeared again and again throughout nearly 2 decades of service. Exceptional judgment under pressure. Lives preserved through restraint. She found that sentence impossible to forget. In the corporate world, success was often measured by victories over competitors. Mason's greatest achievements had been measured by the number of people who returned home safely. The difference humbled her. Later that afternoon, Claire quietly walked toward the front entrance carrying 2 cups of fresh coffee. Mason noticed her approaching and immediately opened the door for an elderly couple before turning back with his usual polite smile. "Good afternoon, Ms. Whitmore." She handed him one of the cups. "This one is for you." Mason accepted it with visible surprise. "Thank you. You did not have to do that." Claire smiled gently. "Perhaps not. But I wanted to." For a moment they simply stood together watching people move through the lobby. Parents holding children's hands. Retirees discussing travel plans. Young couples opening their first savings accounts. Ordinary lives unfolding exactly as they should. "I spent years believing leadership meant staying ahead of everyone else," Claire said quietly. "You taught me that real leadership sometimes means standing behind everyone else to make sure they get home first." Mason looked through the front windows where sunlight reflected across the city sidewalks. "Most people never remember who held the door for them," he answered. "That is all right. The important part is that someone did." Claire lowered her eyes thoughtfully before reaching into a small folder she had carried with her. "The board of directors voted unanimously this morning. We would like to offer you the position of Director of Corporate Security for every Whitmore location in the country. Better salary. Better benefits. A private office. Complete authority over the department." Mason listened respectfully before taking a slow sip of coffee. He remained silent long enough that Claire already knew the answer before he spoke. "It is a generous offer. But," she asked with a faint smile. Mason looked toward the family photo tucked inside his worn wallet. Lily stood in the picture wearing a homemade superhero cape and laughing beneath a bright summer sky. "My daughter still expects me to pick her up every afternoon at 3:15, he said softly. An office with a closed door might make that promise harder to keep. Claire smiled, but this time there were tears shining gently in her eyes. She carefully closed the folder without disappointment. Somehow his answer felt exactly right. As customers continued walking through the lobby, the quiet security guard returned to holding doors open with the same patience he had shown every day before anyone knew the remarkable story he had never felt the need to tell. Autumn arrived quietly in Denver, painting the trees outside Whitmore National Bank with shades of gold and crimson that shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. Nearly 3 months had passed since the morning that had changed so many lives, yet inside the bank something even more remarkable had taken place. People had become kinder. Employees greeted one another by name instead of title. Managers stayed a little longer to help new hires learn instead of rushing to their next meeting. The customer waiting area now included a small bookshelf for children because someone remembered how patiently Mason Beckett always spoke with young families. The changes were subtle, almost invisible, but that was how lasting change usually began. It started quietly. One Friday afternoon, as Mason prepared to leave for the day, he noticed a young security officer standing near the entrance looking unusually discouraged. The young man hesitated before speaking. "Mr. Beckett, can I ask you something?" Mason smiled warmly. "Of course." The officer lowered his voice. "How do you earn people's respect without asking for it?" Mason looked through the front doors where evening sunlight stretched across the sidewalk. For a moment he seemed to search for the simplest answer. "Respect grows the same way a strong tree grows," he said softly. "You do not hear it happening. You simply keep doing the right thing every day, and one morning everyone notices the shade." The young officer quietly nodded, carrying those words with him long after the conversation ended. At exactly 3:15, Mason hung his uniform jacket inside his locker, picked up his lunch bag, and drove toward Jefferson Elementary as he always had. Lily was already waiting outside with a colorful science project held proudly in both hands. The moment she climbed into the truck she began explaining every detail with endless excitement. Mason listened carefully, asking questions, smiling at every answer as though nothing in the world could possibly be more important. Across town, Claire Whitmore stood alone inside her office watching the city skyline slowly glow beneath the setting sun. Her desk still held reports, contracts, and financial forecasts worth millions of dollars, but resting beside them was a simple framed photograph someone had quietly taken several weeks earlier. It showed a security guard kneeling beside his daughter outside an elementary school while she laughed with complete happiness. There were no medals in the picture. No headlines. No applause. Yet Claire considered it the finest portrait of leadership she had ever seen. She reached into her desk drawer and removed the executive nameplate from the front of her office door. The following Monday morning, employees arriving at work noticed a small change beneath her title. The polished brass plate now read, "Claire Whitmore, Chief Executive Officer. My door is open." It was a promise inspired by a man who had never needed an office to lead. Months later, Deputy Chief Ronald Hayes happened to stop by the bank for an unrelated meeting. Before leaving, he found Mason holding the front door open for an elderly couple carrying grocery bags. Hayes smiled to himself and quietly walked away without interrupting. Some heroes, he knew, preferred to remain exactly where they were needed most. As the evening light settled over the city, Mason climbed into his old pickup with Lily beside him, and together they drove toward home, talking about homework, pancakes, and whether their small backyard garden might survive another Colorado winter. The world would probably remember the headlines for only a few days, but the people whose lives had been touched by one quiet father would remember something far more important for the rest of their lives. Real strength does not ask to be seen. Real dignity does not ask to be praised. And sometimes the greatest leader in the room is simply the one who chooses to come home in time to keep a promise to a child. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for more emotional stories like this. And before you go, what state are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below. See you in the next story.